people who have been interested in climate change ask, well, where is it going to be safe, right? Where's the safe haven? Well, there's always been one, New Zealand, right? So I looked at the models and the maps and the projections, and wow, everywhere seemed really bad apart from New Zealand. So obviously, of course, that is no longer the case.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Climate Emergency Forum. My name is Regina, and I will be your host. On this forum, New Zealand, safe haven? Well, it's been touted as such for the last few years. We know that tech moguls have bought huge parcels of land with the understanding that New Zealand is the safest place on the planet in regards to climate change. Cyclone Gabrielle has proven that theory wrong. We start tonight with some insights from Peter Carter. So Peter, I know you've been doing a lot of reading with the IPCC about what we can expect from these storms, and I'm wondering what it is that you've read and how it relates to what happened in New Zealand.
Well, Regina, the thing that only struck me today is that for years and years and years, people who have been interested in climate change ask, well, where is it going to be safe, right? Where's the safe haven? Well, there's always been one, New Zealand, right? So I looked at the models and the maps and the projections, and wow, everywhere seemed really bad apart from New Zealand. So obviously, of course, that is no longer the case, because New Zealand has just suffered its worst ever weather disaster by far. And apparently we're talking about an $8 billion cleanup. And the cleanup, from what I've seen, on the photographs on the news, will be massive. The region affected is vast. It's about 2/3 of the entire North Island that was literally trashed. And there's mud and stuff all over the place. 7 bridges were washed out. I saw some of those, and really washed out. I mean, they've got to have new bridges there. They're just gone. The other thing, though, is that tons of woody debris, logs, and parts of trees have piled up in places, and it'll be a huge job to move those. So the message for everybody should be, waste the time running, because you're not going to be able to hide from climate change, whoever you are and wherever you are. And those poor New Zealanders went through a lot. So they're talking about, as I say, an $8 billion cleanup. I certainly appreciated the unusual response of one government minister who said, this is definitely climate change, and we've really got to do something about the climate. So that was unusually satisfying for somebody like myself. And Auckland, the city of Auckland, had its wettest ever day. And of course, remember that 2 weeks before this cyclone smashed in, the same region had most extreme disastrous heavy rainfall and flooding. So they were really, 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 really hurt, these people. And it's a fruit growing region, apparently, very pleasant fruit growing region. All of those crops have been trashed. So that's all lost.
So Peter, it's interesting that you talked about the safe place that people could go for climate change, because I have to tell you, I do want to touch on the food situation and the crops, but what's really striking to me is how you opened this program talking about how there's really no safe place. Because I remember a few years ago reading articles about how some of these tech billionaires were buying up land in New Zealand and building these underground bunkers, like literally these massive underground bunkers, so that they could survive anything. But as you say, that's really just a fool's journey, isn't it?
Yeah, and underground bunkers, oh, good luck to them. The other thing that strikes me, I've been frustrated for many, many, many years with the sort of conventional wisdom of the science that yes, the poor tropical low latitude regions are very, very vulnerable to climate change, but they have said over and over. In contrast, the global north regions, the wealthier, they've got more technology, right? So the impression has always been given that, oh, we'll be okay up in the temperate north. We can adapt, we can ride out the storm, right? So I must say, that's always seemed to me to be absolute nonsense. This has already been proved many times, but most certainly this terrible disaster in New Zealand has proved that's not the case. That's not the case. So again, the northern temperate wealthy regions with all their science and technology, we are not going to be able, and here's the other thing, the people had 2 weeks warning from the Weather Service, right? So much for adaptation and so much for resilience. The message from one article that I read was you got to mitigate, right? You got to get the emissions down and you got to get putting them down right away. And everybody's going to have to protest and push their governments. The protesters, on the other hand, the media is recognizing, I read an article today, being treated very, very severely by the courts. And that's applying everywhere, which is absolutely shocking. So, we have a minority of brave people who are going out there on the streets and sitting on the sidewalk with placards and maybe holding up in traffic for a little while. They're being arrested and they're going to court and they're being severely sentenced. One case that I read, I don't remember where this was. I think it was no, this was in the UK. A young man who had done one of these non-violent, peaceful, very mild protests. He had been advised by the judge that he was not to mention climate change, global warming, anything like that. So, of course, he did. And he got 8 weeks in jail.
We're reaching very, very scary times on many different levels, Peter, because this controlling of speech, the controlling of the right to free assembly, where's the punishment for the fossil fuel industry? Where's their punishment? This is the big irony, if you ask me. And you spoke about the fruit. A lot of us have enjoyed wines from New Zealand. Now, I've spoken about wine before in past episodes, but it is a multi-billion-dollar industry. New Zealand is very well known for its wines, but if those vines stay damp, they can rot, they can get fungus, and it can destroy many, many wineries. Many people could lose their jobs and their livelihoods, and it could take many, many years. These vines don't just pop up in a year.
Yeah, and the same is true for a lot of agriculture. I mean, we're having a lot more droughts. The IPCC has been very definite on forecasting more frequent, more severe droughts, more intense droughts in what it calls drying or drought-prone regions. But we've already had bad drought in non-drought-prone regions. But severe flooding is just as bad to crop as drought. And it can be worse because it not only ruins the crops, it can ruin the land, waterlogged land that just sits there for a long time. The North Island of New Zealand will have that to deal with. So, it's probably going to cost way more than 8 billion, when you add all that in. The other thing is that New Zealand sort of doesn't get cyclones. There's cyclones in the South Pacific region there, but normally, according to what I read, it doesn't affect New Zealand weather. That's another change all of a sudden. How many wake-up calls have we had over how many years? You keep on reading with the latest, huge climate change-driven disaster that, well, this is our wake-up call. Nobody's waking up yet.
So, Paul, I'm really interested in hearing what you have to say about this, and especially this incredibly dynamic upsurge of water that just deluged the country?
So, most scientific studies on climate change were definitely Northern Hemisphere centric. We tend to quite often ignore the Southern Hemisphere, unless we live down there, but the vast majority of Earth's population lives in the Northern Hemisphere. So the Southern Hemisphere is, of course, vital to the climate system. I mean, we all can talk about Antarctica and sea ice loss around Antarctica and the rapidly melting glaciers and so on, the effect it would have on sea level rise. But we also need to recognize that the Southern oceans are a vast sink for carbon. Because of the ocean circulation patterns, the vertical mixing, it's very important, like in any other ocean, to have water moving upwards carries nutrients, which is very important for the proper growth of phytoplankton, et cetera, at the ocean surface. And the downwelling brings carbon down to deeper, eventually to the seafloor, where it's a carbon sink. It's captured, it's stored in the seafloor, but also oxygen. There's a lot of oxygen in the water at the surface, and that is carried down by downwelling. So the Southern oceans have been warming tremendously fast. You might remember the sort of factoid that over 90% of heat energy, that percentage of global warming, if you like, goes into the oceans, right? It's only the 5 to 10%, say, that goes into the atmosphere that heats the atmosphere, but also, heating the Earth's surface and things like that. But the bulk of the heat is heating the oceans, and the bulk of the heating of the oceans is in the Southern Hemisphere. So it's a wide range, so there's high uncertainty, but it's estimated that about 60 to 90% of the world's ocean heating is in the Southern oceans. But the surface of the ocean is warming significantly in the Southern Hemisphere. And it's also getting a lot saltier because warmer ocean, there's more evaporation. The salt stays in the ocean water when the water evaporates. It's only the freshwater component of seawater that goes up into the atmosphere with some chemicals, dimethyl sulfide, things like that. But basically the salt stays in the water. So the surface oceans are saltier. And there's a freshening of the deeper water layers. So people talk about the surface layer, they talk about the intermediate water layers, which go down from 1,000 to 2,000 meters. And deeper than 2,000 meters, from about 2,000 meters to 4,000 meters, it's called the deep water. And then you have the abyssal water from about 4,000 to 6,000 meters. So there's a whole circulation pattern in the ocean. You're probably aware of the AMOC in the North Atlantic, which is very crucial. And that's slowing down, and possibly, we talk about it stopping even is a possibility, but it's more like that it would be rerouted. It wouldn't go as far north. There'd still be loops in the North Atlantic. But this all connects to the Southern Ocean, which we really don't talk about too much. But specifically, because of the ocean warming in the Southern Hemisphere, there's more and more of these tropical storms that are occurring. Now, just a bit on the nomenclature. I'm talking about hurricanes if we're in the North Atlantic or North Pacific. So if they're in the Northern Hemisphere towards Asia, they're typhoons. And if they're in the Southern Hemisphere, they're called tropical cyclones. And you need to say tropical because cyclones are low pressure areas in meteorology, and anticyclones are high pressure areas in meteorology. So Tropical Storm Gabrielle, it started as a small disturbance northeast of Australia. It started moving, southwest towards the coast of Australia, gaining some strength because the sea surface temperature is about 30 degrees Celsius. Anything above 26.5 degrees Celsius adds energy to these storms. So, it's significantly higher than the threshold to gain energy, quite a bit of energy. And then it curved to the left and headed down towards New Zealand. It did reach about category 3 at one point, but then if you look at the sea surface temperature anomaly, there was nothing special really about the temperatures around New Zealand and northern New Zealand. But Gabrielle came along and it grazed the coastline of New Zealand. It wasn't even that close. But the thing is New Zealand had been primed in the month before by very, very heavy rainfall. There was exceptionally heavy rainfall, so the ground in New Zealand on the North Island was extremely saturated. So when Gabrielle came along, the additional water that fell in the rainfall from Gabrielle in these bands of the cyclone, it had nowhere to go but overland. So it went into the rivers, it was overland water movement. If you know the terrain of New Zealand, it's very hilly, it's very rugged terrain generally. So when you have heavy rainfall on hills, if you don't have proper vegetation rooted deeply, then you get landslides, you get roads washed out. You know, there were many homes that were inundated. And this turned out to be the most expensive, the most significant storm affecting New Zealand in a century, in 100 years. Okay, so it seems it was a really big deal to New Zealand. But if you look at it in the big picture of things, there's a lot of space in the Southern Hemisphere. The Northern Hemisphere is more crowded with lots of land areas, but in the Southern Hemisphere, you can go completely around Antarctica, for example, without hitting any land. If you're on the globe, there's some places in the Pacific you can go where you look and there's almost no land. There's just some islands, but you know, it's really a water world. Remember that about, over 70% of the Earth is actually covered in water, in ocean, not in land. So there's lots of these cyclones, around the planet, but there's so much ocean area that in the Southern Hemisphere, we don't get as many impacts on land. So New Zealand was just very unlucky in the climate casino, and they were hit by this category 2 by the time it was off grazing New Zealand, but the conditions were primed for it to have a significant impact on people and infrastructure in New Zealand. So like I say, they were just very unlucky in the climate casino. So I recently did a video about a very interesting book by Douglas Rushkoff, and the title of the book is Survival of the Richest, Escape Fantasies of the Tech Billionaires. And an interesting commonality amongst billionaires that are described in this book is they have these visions that with their money, they can escape from people if civilization collapses. And a lot of them are think that civilizational collapse is in the cards, and it's going to be very difficult for us to avoid. And because they have more money than they know what to do with, they're looking at sort of escape plans. So, we're talking about the Southern Hemisphere, and New Zealand is considered one of the best bets for moving to escape global turmoil, from whether it be from climate system change, war, food shortages, meteor impact, supervolcano, financial crash, pick your catastrophe, the pandemic, of course. How can I forget the pandemic? So if there's a major disruption which topples lots of civilization, lots of countries, then they plan to escape there. They're buying up bunkers and digging holes in the ground and sticking them well below the surface. And they're trying to develop a safe haven, if you like, where they can go and live with themselves and their friends and families for several years and then sort of emerge. It's all like a big Hollywood disaster movie, really. So New Zealand is considered that. And in fact, Rushkoff, how he started writing the book is he was invited to give a speech to what he thought was 100 different very wealthy investors in the desert in the US. And he gets there, he goes in a room, there's 5 people, 5 sort of billionaires in the room, and they were asking him all these questions, sort of New Zealand or Alaska, where would you go? So that was basically the foundation of his book. So New Zealand, maybe it's losing a bit of its shine with its earthquakes. If the ozone hole was to expand and encompass New Zealand, there would be huge problems down there. But it is quite isolated from the rest of the world, and thus is considered by some of these super wealthy people as sort of an escape place to go. So that's an interesting thing. So, if there's more and more cyclones down there, and like I mentioned, the earthquakes, more and more natural disasters, and they might rethink things and just come to Canada instead.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Paul. I mean, as you say, it was a Category 2 storm, but already, New Zealand was at a vulnerable spot because of previous rains. It's amazing how these slight changes in the environment and the climate can lead to something that is so catastrophic. I mean, the entire country practically flooded. I mean, it's something that's really phenomenal. And I know here in the States, we've seen such things. For example, California, when they get a lot of rain and then more rain comes, we've seen lots and lots of mudslides. So it's that same thing. It's this out of balance that is just making all of these weather events so disastrous for us.
One of the big problems with these disasters, right, is the dots are never made, right, between the fossil fuel industry, right, extracting today more and more of oil, coal, and gas, and burning more and more, and the extreme weather events that we know without any question or shadow of a doubt are directly caused by fossil fuel emissions. I remember 25 years ago, I was in Toronto, and I was invited to present to a Toronto commission that was looking into their climate change plan. And it was a very, very good group. And I was hugely impressed because their lady minister or a member for the environment said, there's a problem here. We're not connecting the dots between the cause of the climate change and what's happening. That's so many years ago, and here we are still. We really do have to start to be a little bit rough with the fossil fuel industry, They're ruining so many regions directly. And they're still lobbying, and they're still using their money, and they're still being highly deceptive.
When are they going to learn that they can't eat profits? They can't drink profits. They can't breathe profits.
I think our indigenous peoples had that to say decades and decades and decades ago, when they saw that what drove, what motivated the European and Euro-American was money, profit, and not much else. That's got to change, and that's got to change very, very, very quickly indeed. Human beings quite naturally and reasonably don't like to linger, on a very nasty big event. That's our natural nature, but on this one, we can't afford to be like that.
Yeah, Peter. So you mentioned, as you so often do, and I always appreciate it, the subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. I mean, the fact that they are costing us so much in our lives, on our planet, and species, and we are paying them to do this to us. Now, you mentioned the 8 billion, and I do believe that's US dollars, to help recoup the losses of New Zealand. $8 billion. Who is going to pay that? Taxpayers are going to pay that. Is the fossil fuel industry going to help clean up the mess? Absolutely not. It has been called a horticultural apocalypse. I don't know how you can get more profound than that. The kiwi fruit, the wine, the potatoes, apples, many vegetables, just rotting in the fields. This is what people need to survive. And instead, they are going to hand over money to the fossil fuel industry, and at the same time, hand over money to government to help clean up the mess that the fossil fuel industry caused. It's irony of ironies. It would be funny if it weren't so tragic.
It's worse than a crime, I mean, governments continuing with disasters all over the world, right? Bang, 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 right? Year round. Governments continuing to give any subsidies to the fossil fuel industry on any moral, ethical standard is manifestly the greatest evil ever. It's an extreme evil.
With all of the tragedies in our world today, and there are so many that it's hard to even keep track, especially following the earthquakes in Turkey and Syria. It's almost sad that the news about this terrible cyclone that has hit New Zealand doesn't even hit below the fold of some of our great newspapers. In fact, I often read the New York Times and the Washington Post. Very little mention of it back of the page. It's really sad, but I'm glad that you're here to hear us talk about it because it warrants discussion. It's incredibly important. And it's an event that we here at the Forum believe that we're going to see more examples of in the future. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. We're glad to have you here at the Forum. If you haven't yet, please be sure to subscribe. We'd love to have you as part of the family. Thank you for joining us for another Climate Emergency Forum.